Hands up. Oh, great. All right, one right there. And let's do one over there on the other side. Get ready.
Thank you.
Put your hand up on that side. All right, there you go. Yes, sir.
This question is for Victor Dover. It wasn't lost on me that you kind of just went right past roundabouts and even mentioned them by name. There were some facilitators. There were some facilitators in Florida really pushing them 10 or 15 years ago as pedestrian safety schemes. I think reducing conflict points from like 12 to 8 and those kinds of things. Just what is your general feeling about roundabouts?
Well, I'll say street design depends on great intersection design. Some of those intersections have a thing in the middle of the road, and sometimes that thing is a roundabout. And there are ones we love and ones we hate, and the ones we love are the ones that focus on the subject we're all dealing with here, making a great place. And the ones we don't like so much are the ones that look like they did the engineering but not the placemaking. And so there is a lot to be praised about the modern roundabouts. Huge reduction in injuries and accidents, a huge reduction in death and mayhem, and that's a good thing. And the way it works is you drop the speed because people, to use that space the way you use it in a modern roundabout have to do so at a moderate pace. So the first question is that the only way I could drop the speed? And if so, how can I make it a place and not just a circular thing in the road? They're in all shapes and sizes. So the answer is, there is an answer, and the answer is it depends. But if it just looks like a bunch of bright yellow stripes and bright yellow signs, we probably haven't done our work.
To Matthew, you ended your speech talking that streets should be seen, should be regarded as places. But from we saw from your drawings, you were showing more, you were rather talking about blocks rather than streets, because you turn around the block, the corner of the street, showing the area which hasn't been polarized by the high street influence. So streets demand one one typical design, but blocks don't. Well, can you develop about that?
So your last point was streets require what, but blocks don't?
You are showing the streets, but you rather showed the whole block.
Yeah.
And you don't design a block as you design a street.
No, but my point was that you can't have a mixed street without the blocks that face onto that street. And so you need to see them as one unit. The blocks very much fill the streets with the life that they have. But are often forgotten. What's behind the facade of the street is often forgotten. And that's where a lot of the life and activity and functions of the city exists. As I showed through our research, in London, it's incredible the amount of employment which is based on one block along our mixed streets. And until you actually go and look into that, nobody even knew that existed there, at least at those quantities. So my argument is that you need to understand not just the street, not just the road in particular, but the whole entity that surrounds it. And the one block crust is critically important in understanding that.
Yes.
Hello. Who could tell me anything about shopping malls? They seem to be the elephant in the room. And in Bogota, for instance, the Transmilenio that you mentioned, the Transmilenio are not going to hospitals or schools. They're going directly to shopping malls. So how do you control that infrastructure, and who, if anyone, is leading the way in controlling those developments?
Mall is a 4-letter word.
That's it?
Well, actually these points are connected because we're not just looking at a building type, not just a storefront or a box with a skylight with stores inside, but an ecosystem. So if we were looking at a single plant species, or a single molecule or bacteria in its own petri dish, that would be a different kind of analysis, right? But your research says this is part of a system, and the system includes destinations and they change from generation to generation.
But they seem to have a lot of power. So my question is, how do you bring them back
You have to play on people's desires, but you also have to appeal to the wisdom of good regulation. And so if you expect just to demand something from the developers or the investors, like investing in a sustainable town form instead of an unsustainable one, you also have to have smart regulation to go with that and be prepared to defend it like you meant it when you said it or when you wrote it.
I think they're good and bad shopping centres, just like they're good and bad everything else. You know, it's the example that I showed in London, the big shopping centre, the Westfield. There's one in West London that's just been built. There's equally one in East London, which has also just been built at exactly the same time. But the one in East London uses streets, and you can actually see the sky as you walk around it. And it uses a series of forms which are adaptable and can change over time, whereas the one in West London isn't. It's just a big box. So I think, you know, we shouldn't necessarily say that all shopping centres are bad, but we need to think about how we design and integrate them within the city.
I won't refer to malls because that's definitely not part of our business, but I do see the point that you're raising in terms of how these urban mobility infrastructure is designed and whether in that planning process there's enough reliable data to have the appropriate choices and the designs. And that's what is lacking in many of the developing cities. There are no OD surveys, there are no technological tools to have appropriate data to feed into the planning process. And that's part of what we are working. I showed one of the slides that showed GDFS feeds in Buenos Aires to identify the number of employment opportunities that can be reached within 60 minutes of public transit. The same for schools, hospitals. So using the new technologies, strengthening the capabilities of municipal governments to better design mobility infrastructure to ensure that the most vulnerable have the opportunity to access employment, schools, health centers, to promote inclusion.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Rafael. I'm from Toronto. And one question that I had was, how do we maintain the social mix when we begin to look at land use mix? And I ask that because a lot of times what happens is when we begin to enhance and improve the human scale in certain parts of the city, we actually push the people out that made that place so vibrant. And they end up relocating to other areas of the city where the problems that they lived with now exist. So how do we maintain the land use mix and keep that social mix, and so we don't end up gentrifying?
Good.
I think the problem with gentrification is always a real challenge. What we can't have is cities that are preserved in aspic, so that a particular social mix is always going to be there forevermore. Cities change and the populations of cities move around and change with it. So as we invest in one place, the population will change and so forth. At the same time, we've got to be careful that we're not unfairly pushing people out who have perhaps lived in a place all their lives, or and creating undue pressures of gentrification. So we have to inoculate places against gentrification by investing in social housing and allowing spaces for small businesses and so forth to generate. So we need to think about that as part of our original design strategy. But we can't, I think, stop all gentrification. And some people would argue that in some places we need a little bit of gentrification.
Well, one of the things we tend to do is focus on one metric, like housing affordability, and not look at the entirety. For example, transportation affordability. So if we are making a place more desirable, we should also be improving its transportation options and lowering transportation costs for the average user. That way, when we look at housing and transportation together, the number goes down rather than growing inevitably. If we look at housing affordability alone, we might be looking at improving a place where that number has been suppressed by neglect or disinvestment or oppression, and it needs to be elevated. It needs to be brought back to equilibrium. And there's a place where you don't have to forget about the law of supply and demand, because the part of the law of supply and demand that does work for you is the idea that scarcity increases prices, and we need to address scarcity by making plenty of these places, many, many places where we can go enjoy the good life or the ideas or the access that all the presentations have been describing. But we can't do that without thinking simultaneously about making the places and the transportation systems. Now, what the transportation focus for decades and decades and decades on every single continent has been on car, which is the most expensive way to move people from any given household at any given income level from one place to another. So if we're serious about getting the benefits of urban revitalization and regeneration, and if we're serious about not feeling guilty about gentrification, then we need to be investing in transportation for everybody.
Yes,
Just
sir.
two ideas on that, and it's the key role of the government, of the state. You can't leave it to the private sector. You need the state to regulate, to take those ideas into consideration, to have the guidelines on how these processes should evolve and take place. And then citizen engagement, to make visible these choices and give the weapons to the most vulnerable in that community to have their voice heard. Because that's what, in my view, at the heart of the exclusions, the social, economic, and physical exclusion, that there's no exercise of citizenship by huge numbers of populations in urban areas in Latin America and other developing regions in the world.
What a fantastic morning. Thank you very much. I find it very inspiring. Toronto has got a great transit authority, and it's got great neighborhoods. I used to live in a neighborhood that transformed itself with or without government, I don't know, 10 times in 20 years. First the Greeks came on Danforth Avenue with 150 restaurants, and and then the Turks came and added their greengrocers, and the street redeveloped, and the South Koreans came, and it was all possible because of the transit authority and because of Toronto just being so attractive, I think. London baffles me time and time again, and what you showed today with the high streets, and do you have a high street authority? I understand because we work with shopping street management, and we've just been able to sort of mix the biz, or the bid as they call it in America, with place management, because we find that that's where it's at. And that sort of adds to what you're saying with the block behind the street, and it sort of makes it all come back. It's all one. Do you have this in London, or a movement towards that?
I think the best places are there to baffle us, and that's what's great about them, and that's why they are sexy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we do have bids in London, but they tend to focus on just the town centres,
Right.
the most busy retail,
Right.
the most busy and vibrant retail centres, and they don't focus on all of the small local high streets that go through London, which tend to get ignored as a result.
It's a lack of organization, as you said before.
Yeah.
And I think, if there's added value, you can start taking percentages from that. Like,
Exactly.
I guess, was it Bryant Park once did?
It's not just policy or just design or just management. It's all those things at once. And I think when you compare what you just described to the ascendance of the malls that were brought up before. Okay, well, the malls putting on exhibit for us both the power and the peril of common management. They have common advertising, they have a common tenant mix strategy, they have common hours of operation. And on the other hand, they also have the cold, dead hand of everything here seems to be owned and controlled by one person, as opposed to seeming like a place that organically grew, like the high streets or the informal settlements for that matter. And we need to have some of the power of common management and help our high streets succeed. Those common hours of operation, that common sense. That makes sense. Then they can compete with the malls. And we've seen that, actually, in many cases where the high streets go into decline, the malls pop up on their borders, and then the malls actually can't sustain the competition as time changes and the main street comes back. So that's actually quite gratifying to see, of course. But we also want to avoid the cold, dead hand, the sterile aspect that is so on display at the mall itself, the typical shopping center, the Westfields and what have you. Those places, they're not actually they're great at moving merchandise, I suppose, but they're not that great at transferring ideas. And we're not loyal to them in the same way that we are loyal to those high streets, sexy or unsexy.
Speaking of sexy, solutions for the 21st century, Victor, Veronica, Matthew, thank you very much indeed.